The silken rustling stops. Queen Eleanor of Austria, 16 years old and 3 days into labor, grips the carved bedpost until her knuckles turn white. The tapestries covering every window block out the December sun, transforming her royal chamber into a tomb of crimson fabric and melting beeswax. She can hear them through the walls, the whispered conversations of courtiers already discussing her replacement. Her ladies-in-waiting hover like ghosts in the candlelight, their faces masks of practiced calm that cannot hide the fear bleeding through. They know what everyone in the palace knows, but dare not speak aloud. The Queen's screams have grown weaker. The midwife's encouraging words have turned to prayers. And somewhere in the corridors beyond this suffocating chamber, ambassadors draft letters to foreign courts about eligible princesses. 3 days. That's how long Eleanor has been sealed inside this room, following the ancient protocols that transform birthing chambers into prisons. No fresh air, no natural light, no escape. The traditions meant to protect royal births have become instruments of torture, and the very rituals designed to ensure the succession might kill both mother and heir before dawn breaks again. The midwife's hands tremble as she reaches for her instruments. Outside, footsteps echo on stone, too many footsteps, moving too quickly. The Queen's breath catches not from pain but from understanding. She recognizes that particular pattern of boots on marble. The King's advisors only walk like that when preparing for one specific ceremony. They're coming to measure her for her shroud. How does a society transform its most powerful women into prisoners, one tradition at a time, until queens suffocate in rooms meant to celebrate new life? You're about to discover the brutal mathematics of medieval queenship, where every protocol stripped away another piece of humanity until even childbirth became a death sentence wrapped in silk and ceremony. Because what happened to Eleanor of Austria in that December chamber wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable conclusion of centuries perfecting the art of royal confinement. The process began with a sound, the scratch of a quill, the low murmur of men's voices, and the soft, wet plink of a tear hitting a sheet of parchment. That single drop of salt water blurred the ink of a name that was not yet her own, a name that would belong to a husband she had never met, in a country she had never seen. She was 12 years old. The contract she was signing was not a promise. It was a cage, and as the heavy wax seal was stamped beside her trembling signature, she heard another sound, the sound of her childhood ending. This is where the fairy tale shatters. It was a market, plain and simple, a high-stakes trade floor where the commodities were not spices or gold, but girls, royal daughters. They were not people, they were assets. Currency in the brutal game of alliances and land grabs. Their value was measured in potential heirs and the acreage of their dowries. A map of Europe was drawn and redrawn with their marriage contracts. A peace treaty was signed with a 7-year-old's hand. A war was averted with a 10-year-old's dowry. It was all so terribly practical, so horrifyingly normal. Think of Isabella of Valois, betrothed at 6, a child queen sent to England, or Margaret of Austria, promised to the future King of France at the age of 3. She was raised in the French court, taught its language, its customs, its ways. She was groomed to be its queen. Then, after 10 years, politics shifted, the treaty broke, and she was sent back home, a returned good, damaged, useless to them now. The sounds that defined her childhood were the slamming of carriage doors, first one way, then the other. She learned her first lesson in queenship. You are only worth what a man can get for you. For the girls who weren't sent back, the journey itself was a trial. Imagine being a child, ripped from your home, from everyone you know and love. Put into a carriage that jolts and sways for weeks, even months, over rutted, muddy roads. The same faces of your guards stare back at you day after day. The only familiar sound is the weeping of your ladies-in-waiting. You eat stale bread and salted meat. You sleep in strange inns where you hear foreign voices muttering through the thin wooden walls. You are not on a grand adventure. You are cargo being delivered, and you pray the journey never ends, because you know that what waits for you at the destination is far more terrifying than the road. The arrival was not a relief. It was a sentence. The castle gates would swing open, the sound echoing across the stone courtyard. Then they would boom shut behind you, a sound of finality, a sound of possession. You step out of the carriage, blinking in the unfamiliar light. Hundreds of faces stare at you. They are not smiling, they are assessing, judging the fabric of your dress, the pallor of your skin, the fear in your eyes. And you cannot understand a single word they are whispering. The language is a wall of noise. The laughter sounds like mockery. The food tastes alien. The air smells wrong. Every comfort of home is gone. You are a stranger in the place you must now call home, a prisoner in your own palace. This isolation was a weapon. It was designed to break them. A young queen, surrounded by people, was never more alone. The ladies in waiting sent with her were often dismissed, replaced by women loyal to her new family. Spies in silk dresses. They watched her every move. They reported her every word. Who could she trust? The nervous girl who helped her dress in the morning? The stern-faced matron who sat by her fire at night? Every whisper could be a report. Every shared secret could be a betrayal. The rustling of their gowns in the hallway became a sound of paranoia. We know their terror because they wrote it down, in smuggled letters sent home with trusted messengers, letters that read like cries for help. Anne of Brittany, a duchess in her own right, fought to keep her independence. She was a ruler, but the great powers of Europe circled her like wolves. She was forcibly married by proxy to Maximilian of Austria. A stand-in, an ambassador, literally placed his leg into her marriage bed as a symbol of consummation. The ceremony was a legal fiction, but the violation felt real. She wrote to a cousin, her quill scratching frantically across the page, begging for help that would never come. She was trapped, she was married, and soon another king would come to claim her, erasing the first marriage and forcing her into another. Her body was a battlefield for the future of France. This was the brutal mathematics of power. A princess was a political tool, and her personal feelings were an irrelevance. She was taught from birth that her body was not her own. It belonged to the state. It belonged to the dynasty. Her purpose was singular, to provide an heir. Everything else, her happiness, her safety, her life, was secondary. The pretty dresses, the glittering jewels, the elaborate titles, they were all just gift wrapping on a package of flesh and blood being traded for power. The contract was signed in a room full of men. The journey was endured under the watch of men. The arrival was orchestrated by men. And every step of the way, the walls were closing in, stripping away her name, her home, her very self. They learned to navigate this treacherous new world. They learned the new language, the new customs. They learned to smile when they wanted to scream. They learned to flatter men they despised. They learned to turn their ladies in waiting from spies into allies. They became masters of the soft power wielded in corridors and bedchambers. Some even grew to love their husbands. Some found a measure of contentment, but they never forgot the sound of that first door slamming shut. They never forgot the feeling of being utterly, terrifyingly alone. The contract was the first chain. The journey was the second, and the wedding ceremony was the lock on the cell door. It was all a prelude. A long, slow, and deliberate march toward the one room where their fate would finally be sealed. But the marriage contract was just paper. What happened on the wedding night would haunt queens for centuries. The footsteps started at sunset. First one pair of boots on stone, then 2, then 20. By the time darkness fell completely, the corridor outside the bridal chamber thrummed with the sound of gathering witnesses. Each new arrival brought fresh whispers that slithered under the heavy oak door. The young bride sat rigid on the edge of the vast bed, her wedding gown weighing her down like armor she couldn't remove. Catherine of Aragon was 11 years old when she first heard those particular footsteps, the measured tread of Spanish nobles mixed with the sharper clip of English courtiers. The sound built and built until it became a drumbeat of expectation pounding against her skull. Her new English ladies clustered around her, their faces carefully blank as they prepared her for what would come next. The rustling of their skirts couldn't mask the trembling of their hands. The door swung open. The hinges groaned under its weight, a sound that would echo in her nightmares for decades. The procession began filing in, bishops in their ceremonial robes, ambassadors clutching sealed documents, court physicians with their leather bags, and at the very end, walking with the confidence of ownership, her husband, Prince Arthur, all of 15 years old himself, trying to look like a man while his voice still cracked. This was tradition, this was protocol. The consummation of a royal marriage required witnesses, not to the act itself, though some courts demanded even that, but to the preparation, to the blessing, to the verification that would follow. The crowd pressed closer, filling the chamber with the smell of wine and sweat and anticipation. Someone coughed, someone else laughed nervously. The sound bounced off the stone walls like a threat. The archbishop stepped forward, his gold cross catching the candlelight. Latin prayers tumbled from his lips while the witnesses watched. Some had travelled for days to be here. To see this child bride delivered to her duty. The prayer droned on. Catherine's fingers twisted in her lap. She understood perhaps half the words. The rest washed over her like water she might drown in. Behind the archbishop, she could hear them. The court ladies who would inspect the sheets come morning. The physicians who would examine her if the marriage failed to produce the necessary blood. The diplomats who would write detailed reports to foreign courts about the success or failure of this night. Every person in this room had a stake in what happened next. Every person except her. The blessing ended with a splash of holy water that made her flinch. The drops hit her face like cold tears. Then came the next phase of the ritual, the disrobing. Not complete, not yet, but enough to satisfy the witnesses that bride and groom were capable of fulfilling their duty. Arthur's hands shook as he removed his outer robe. The sound of the fabric hitting the floor made several courtiers lean forward eagerly. They wanted a show. They wanted proof. Some courts demanded the couple climb into bed while the witnesses watched. Others required the bride to be examined beforehand, to confirm her virginity before the act that would destroy it. The variations were endless, but the core remained the same. This was not about love. This was not even about desire. This was a business transaction, and everyone needed to verify the goods. Margaret Tudor faced an even more invasive ritual when she married the King of Scotland. The witnesses didn't just fill her chamber. They surrounded the bed itself, creating a human wall of eyes and expectations. The bed curtains, usually drawn for privacy, were tied back. Nothing would be hidden, nothing would be left to chance or doubt. The Scottish court had specific traditions about what constituted proper consummation. The English princess would learn them all that night. The physicians were the worst part. They hovered like vultures, ready to swoop in at the first sign of difficulty. Their presence turned what should have been intimate into something clinical, medical. They carried oils and implements, ready to assist if nature failed to take its course, ready to ensure that political necessity triumphed over human frailty. The clink of their instruments against each other created a rhythm of dread. Some brides fought back in small ways. Eleanor of Castile insisted on keeping certain veils in place, using religious modesty as her shield. Joan of Navarre demanded that at least the female witnesses stand closer than the men, creating a barrier of silk skirts between her and the leering crowd. But these were tiny victories in a battle they'd already lost. The footsteps would still come. The door would still open. The witnesses would still watch. The morning after brought its own fresh horrors. The inspection of the sheets, the parade of blood-stained linen through the court like a battle standard. In some kingdoms, these sheets were literally hung from windows, announcing to the world that the marriage was valid, that the bride had been pure, that the dynasty's future was secure. The cheers from the crowd below mixed with the private tears above. But what happened when there was no blood? When nerves or youth or simple biology failed to provide the required evidence? The whispers started immediately, sharp as knives and twice as deadly. Physicians were summoned for more thorough examinations, humiliating, invasive, reducing a young woman to her component parts, searching for proof of either virginity or its loss. The scratch of quill on parchment as they recorded their findings. The slam of doors as advisors hurried to discuss the implications. Anne of Cleves discovered the price of failure when her marriage to Henry VIII collapsed. The king claimed non-consummation. The entire English court buzzed with speculation about what had or hadn't happened in the royal bedchamber. She endured months of questioning, lawyers picking apart every detail of her wedding night, physicians examining her body for evidence, the rustle of legal documents growing thicker by the day, her reputation shredded as publicly as those wedding sheets should have been displayed. The trauma echoed through generations. Young princesses were coached from childhood about what to expect, how to endure, how to perform their duty despite the audience, how to produce the necessary evidence even if nature failed to cooperate. Some mothers slipped their daughters vials of chicken blood, just in case. Others taught them to pinch themselves hard enough to draw drops of their own, survival tactics passed down like heirlooms. The psychological damage was incalculable. These queens learned from their first night of marriage that their bodies were public property, that their most intimate moments would be witnessed, discussed, documented. That privacy was a luxury they would never afford. The sound of footsteps in the corridor would forever make them tense. The opening of a door would bring back that first terrible night when childhood truly ended. In their letters home, when they dared write honestly, they described nightmares that lasted decades. The feeling of being watched never left them. Even in moments of genuine affection with husbands they'd grown to care for, the ghost of that witnessing crowd haunted their bedchambers. Some never recovered. They fulfilled their duties, produced their heirs, but something inside them had broken the night those footsteps stopped outside their door. The tradition persisted because it worked, not for the brides, never for them, but for the system that needed to verify its investments, to ensure its alliances, to guarantee its successions. Every witnessed consummation was a chain in the link that bound kingdoms together. Every inspected sheet was a contract signed in blood. Every traumatized girl was a necessary sacrifice to the great game of royal marriage. The sounds of those nights echoed through palace corridors for centuries. The footsteps gathering, the doors opening, the whispers spreading, the quills scratching out reports. Each sound another bar in the cage that would hold these queens for the rest of their lives. Because surviving the wedding night was never the end of their ordeal. It was merely the beginning. But surviving the wedding night was just the beginning. The real terror started when her monthly bleeding stopped. The chambermaid's whisper cut through the morning stillness like a blade through silk. "Your Majesty, you've missed your courses." 5 words that transformed everything. 5 words that turned a private bodily function into a matter of state. The young queen's hand instinctively moved to her belly, not yet showing any sign of the life that might be growing within. But already she could hear it, the sound of her privacy dying. Within hours, the news spread through the castle like fire through dry timber. First the soft footsteps of the chambermaid hurrying to the queen's chief lady. Then the heavier tread of that lady rushing to find the king's physician. The physician's boots clicked sharply on stone as he summoned his colleagues. By noon, the corridors thundered with the movement of courtiers, each desperate to position themselves around this fresh development. The queen sat in her chambers, listening to her secret becoming everybody's business. The physicians arrived in a pack. Their black robes rustled like crows' wings as they filed into her presence. She counted them. 7. 7 learned men come to discuss her womb as if it were a matter of agricultural yield. They brought their instruments, cold metal things that clinked against each other in their leather bags. They brought their questions. When had she last bled? Had there been nausea, tender breasts, changes in appetite? Each query stripped away another layer of her dignity. The examination itself was worse than the questions. Behind a screen, yes, but the screen was thin. She could hear the courtiers breathing on the other side, could hear them shifting their weight, craning for any hint of what was happening. The physician's hands were cold despite the fire roaring in the grate, their touch clinical, assessing. They murmured to each other in Latin, discussing her body as if she weren't there, as if she were already just a vessel. The metal instruments touched her skin, and she bit her lip to keep from crying out. Not from pain, from rage at being reduced to this. When Christine de Pizan documented these early pregnancy rituals, she wrote of queens who wept through their examinations. Not tears of joy at potential motherhood, tears of humiliation at becoming public property. The moment conception was suspected, a queen's body ceased to belong to her. It belonged to the dynasty, to the kingdom, to history itself. Every twinge would be analyzed, every appetite scrutinized, every bodily function monitored and recorded. The scratch of quills on parchment became the soundtrack to her transformation from person to incubator. The formal announcement required its own elaborate choreography. The queen would be dressed in specific colors, positioned at precise angles. The herald's trumpet would sound exactly 3 times. The words had been written centuries ago, modified only slightly for each new queen, each new pregnancy. The crowd would cheer on cue. Bells would ring across the kingdom. Bonfires would blaze in celebration. All while the queen stood perfectly still, perfectly composed, the growing life inside her already belonging more to them than to her. But the public celebration masked private terror. Every queen knew the statistics, even if they never spoke them aloud. 1 in 3 royal pregnancies ended in loss. The pressure for a male heir multiplied those dangers. Queens who produced only daughters faced replacement. Queens who miscarried faced suspicion. Was she too active? Too sedentary? Had she eaten something she shouldn't? Had she harbored impure thoughts? The blame always fell on her. Isabella of Portugal learned this lesson in the cruelest way. 3 times she stood before the court to announce a pregnancy. 3 times the bells rang and the crowds cheered. 3 times she retreated to her chambers as the life inside her failed to thrive. After the first miscarriage, the physicians doubled their vigilance. After the second, they tripled it. By the 3rd pregnancy, she could barely breathe without someone taking note. Her ladies recorded every morsel she ate. Her physicians documented every hour she slept. Her confessor interrogated her about every stray thought. The scratching of their collective quills followed her everywhere, documentation of her failures. Evidence for the inevitable trial of being unable to fulfill her only purpose. The protection became imprisonment. Queens were forbidden to ride horses once pregnancy was confirmed. Too dangerous. They were forbidden to climb stairs without assistance. Too risky. Dancing was prohibited. Walking limited. Even reading could be restricted if the physicians deemed the material too stimulating. Each prohibition came with its own ceremony of announcement. Another freedom formally stripped away. Another door closed. The walls closing in with medical precision. Some queens tried to hide their conditions, desperate to maintain a few weeks of autonomy. But the body betrayed them. Morning sickness was impossible to conceal when servants hovered constantly. The changing shape of their bodies was monitored by seamstresses who reported every altered measurement. Even their monthly linens were inspected, counted, documented. Privacy was a foreign concept, a dangerous luxury that no dynasty could afford. The rumors started with the first missed cycle. Whispers in alcoves, meaningful glances across great halls. If months passed without an announcement, the whispers grew louder. Foreign ambassadors sent coded messages home. Rival factions at court began positioning themselves. The queen might not even be certain herself, but already the wolves were circling. Already the speculation about her potential failure was beginning. The sound of those whispers was sometimes louder than any formal proclamation. Margaret of Anjou endured 7 years of these whispers before finally producing an heir. 7 years of monthly disappointments, 7 years of increasingly invasive treatments. Physicians prescribed everything from special diets to barbaric procedures. She drank potions that made her retch, endured treatments that left her weeping, submitted to examinations that grew more desperate with each passing season. The entire English court held its breath with her every month, waiting for news that never came. When pregnancy finally did occur, the relief was so intense it nearly killed her. The stress of those 7 barren years had worn her body down to almost nothing. The cruelest part was how public the failures were. A queen's menstrual cycle was tracked by dozens of people. Her ladies knew. Her laundresses knew. Her physicians certainly knew. Each month that passed without conception was a public failure. Each miscarriage a state crisis. The blood that should have been private became evidence in the case against her. Proof that she was failing in her essential duty. Some courts actually displayed the stained linens of miscarriage, forcing the Queen to endure her loss under the eyes of those already calculating her replacement. The successful pregnancies brought their own torments. Once confirmed, the Queen became community property in ways that defied modern comprehension. Her diet was controlled down to the last morsel. Committees decided what she could eat, when she could eat it, how it should be prepared. Physicians tasted everything first, not just for poison, but for proper humoral balance. Too much heat in the food might damage the child. Too much cold might slow its growth. The clink of spoons against plates as they tested each dish. The murmur of consultation before she was allowed a single bite. Her movements were choreographed like a dance. She could walk here, but not there. Sit in this chair, but not that one. The windows must be opened just so. The fire banked just right. Even her thoughts were policed. Too much worry might mark the child. Too much joy might overexcite it. She must maintain perfect equilibrium, perfect calm, while inside the pressure built like steam in a kettle. Some queens described feeling like puppets, their strings pulled by the collective will of the court. Every gesture watched, every word weighed, every emotion suppressed for the good of the child that belonged to everyone but her. The preparation for lying in began months before the birth. Like watching her own tomb being constructed, special chambers were prepared according to ancient protocols. The walls hung with specific tapestries depicting appropriate scenes. Nothing violent, nothing disturbing, only calm, religious imagery that would imprint itself on the developing child. The windows measured and covered with precise lengths of fabric. The doors reinforced. The locks checked and double-checked. Each preparation another step toward the final confinement. They called it protection, but she could hear the truth in every hammered nail. This wasn't about keeping danger out. This was about keeping her in. The preparations intensified as her belly grew. More tapestries, more locks, more protocols. The very air in the chambers was considered. Special braziers burning specific herbs. Prayers said over every threshold. Holy water sprinkled in careful patterns. All of it designed to create a sacred space. All of it actually creating a prison. Some queens left records of their growing panic as the time approached. Anne of Brittany wrote of nightmares where the tapestries came alive and wrapped around her throat. Catherine of Braganza described feeling like she was being buried alive in layers of ritual and fabric. They could feel their world shrinking with each passing week. The walks in the garden shortened, the visitors restricted, the doors to the outside world closing one by one until only the birthing chamber remained. They could hear those doors closing, each one a definitive thud, each one another barrier between them and escape. The announcement of pregnancy was supposed to be joyful, the bells were supposed to ring in celebration, but the queens heard something different in those bronze voices. They heard the countdown beginning. They heard their freedom dying. They heard the sound of walls being built around them, stone by stone, tradition by tradition. The very success they'd been commanded to achieve became the trap that would close around them, because carrying an heir meant entering the most dangerous phase of queenship, the phase where even breathing became a political act. As her belly swelled, so did the preparations for a ritual that would strip away her last shred of freedom. The hammer strikes echoed through the palace like a countdown to doom. Each nail driven into wood marked another window sealed, another escape route blocked. The queen stood in the center of her chambers, watching the workmen transform her living space into something else entirely. A sanctuary, they called it, a sacred space for royal birth. She heard different words in every hammer blow: prison, tomb, trap. The transformation began 3 months before her time. First came the tapestry merchants, their carts creaking under the weight of heavy fabrics, scenes from the lives of saints. The Virgin Mary cradling the Christ child, images meant to inspire and protect. The queen watched them unfurl across her walls like shrouds. Each one blocked another view of the outside world. The rustling of the heavy fabric sounded like whispers, promises of the darkness to come. Margaret of York documented every step of her confinement preparation. The workers arrived at dawn, she wrote, their boots thundering through corridors that had once known only the soft step of slippers. They carried lumber and tools, nails and hammers. They worked with grim efficiency, following plans drawn up centuries before she was born. No deviation allowed, no mercy for her protests. The windows must be covered just so. The light must be blocked completely. Tradition demanded it. The head carpenter was a man who'd done this before. 3 queens had entered confinement under his preparations. Only 2 had emerged. He never spoke of the 3rd, but the queen could see her ghost in the careful way he measured each board, in the extra nails he used, in the way his hands trembled slightly when he reached the window that faced the cemetery. Every motion carried the weight of that failure. Every sealed window was both protection and potential epitaph. The religious preparations came next. Priests arrived with holy water and incense, blessed candles and sacred relics. They moved through her chambers like an invasion, claiming every corner for their rituals. Latin prayers echoed off stone walls. Smoke from the censers made her cough, but she wasn't allowed to open a window. The windows were already gone, hidden behind wood and fabric. The air grew thick with blessing and dread. Her ladies watched it all with knowing eyes. Some had served other queens through this transformation. They knew what each change meant: the removal of mirrors to prevent vanity, the installation of special locks that could only be opened from the outside, the careful placement of religious statues where she couldn't avoid their painted gazes. Each addition subtracted something from her humanity. Each protection became another bar in an increasingly elaborate cage. The selection of attendants followed its own brutal logic. Male servants were banished first. Even the aged chamberlain who'd served her since her arrival was forbidden entry once the preparations began. Only women allowed. But not just any women. They must be proven mothers themselves. They must be of unimpeachable reputation. They must be approved by both church and crown. The interviews took weeks. Questions probed into every aspect of their lives, their thoughts, their loyalties. The Queen had no say in these selections. Women she'd grown to trust were dismissed for obscure reasons. A lady's laugh was deemed too loud, another's prayers too quiet. One was sent away because her own children had been born under inauspicious stars. In their place came strangers, severe women in dark gowns who spoke in whispers and moved like shadows. Their rustling skirts sounded like serpents as they circled her, learning her routines, her preferences, her weaknesses. The midwife arrived last, carrying a leather bag that clinked with mysterious instruments. She was a woman who'd delivered princes and witnessed queens die trying. Her face showed nothing as she examined the preparations. She tested the bed ropes, counted the linens, inspected the braziers that would heat water and cauterizing irons. Each assessment was marked in a ledger she carried, documentation of readiness, evidence that all protocols had been followed, insurance against blame if anything went wrong. The Queen submitted to her first examination behind screens that did nothing to muffle sound. The midwife's hands were businesslike, efficient, treating the royal body like a machine to be assessed. She measured and prodded, making notes about positioning and passage width. The scratch of her quill was methodical, recording facts that would become either triumph or tragedy. The other women waited beyond the screen, their breathing audible in the stillness. The relics arrived in a solemn procession, fragments of saints' bones in golden reliquaries, a splinter of the true cross, the Virgin's girdle, or at least what centuries of tradition claimed it to be, each one carefully placed around the chamber. Some hung above the bed, others positioned at the threshold. The most precious went beneath her pillow, where their holiness would seep into her dreams. The priests assured her these protections were powerful, but their careful placement looked more like a ritual binding than a blessing. Food preparations changed too. No longer could she eat what she pleased when she pleased. Special meals were prepared according to medical doctrine, each ingredient chosen for its humoral properties. Each combination tested first on her tasters. The kitchen sounds that drifted up to her chambers changed. Less laughter, more murmured consultation. The cheerful clatter of normal meal preparation replaced by the careful clink of measuring implements. Even nourishment became medicine. Even hunger became regulated. The final month brought the most dramatic changes. The outer chambers were sealed off. The Queen's world shrank to 3 rooms: the bedchamber where she would labor, an antechamber for the attendants, a small chapel for prayer. The doors between them remained open, but the doors to the world beyond were barred. She could hear life continuing outside. Footsteps in corridors she could no longer access. Laughter in gardens she could no longer see. The palace lived and breathed around her while she suffocated in her silk-wrapped cell. Eleanor of Provence left detailed accounts of those final weeks. The walls seemed to close in, she wrote. The tapestries hung so heavy they muffled all sound from outside. The candles never quite pushed back the darkness that pooled in corners. The air grew thick despite the hidden ventilation. Each breath became an effort. Each movement monitored by the ever-present women who watched her like guards. She dreamed of running but woke to find even walking required permission and assistance. The religious intensity increased daily. More prayers, more blessings, more relics added to the growing collection. The chapel in her chambers hosted constant services. The drone of Latin never ceased. When one priest tired, another took his place. The constant reminder of mortality, dressed in the language of salvation. Some queens found comfort in this. Others heard only the preview of their own funeral rites. The same prayers that blessed their labor would speak over their bodies if they failed. The bed itself became an altar of suffering. Special linens blessed by bishops, ropes tested and retested for the pulling, posts carved with religious symbols, every element designed for the dual purpose of birth and potential death. The carpenters who installed the final modifications worked in silence. Some queens reported hearing them whispering prayers as they worked. Others heard only the rasp of wood being shaped to cradle agony. As her time approached, the final transformations began. Servants she'd known for years disappeared, replaced by the chosen attendants. Her jewels were locked away. Vanity had no place in the birthing chamber. Her gowns were replaced with simple shifts, easy to remove, easy to replace if soaked with blood. Even her hair was bound in prescribed ways. Nothing left to chance, nothing left to choice. Every detail determined by centuries of tradition that prioritized the child over the mother. The sounds of the palace changed around her isolation. Courtiers gathered in distant rooms, their voices a low rumble through the walls. Ambassadors paced in anterooms, ready to carry news of success or failure. Physicians consulted in hushed tones just beyond her door. Everyone waiting, everyone watching, the entire kingdom holding its breath while she held hers. The pressure built like storm clouds. The very air seemed to thicken with expectation. Some queens broke before the labor even began. The accumulated weight of preparation, isolation, and fear proved too much. They wept until the physicians sedated them. They begged for their mothers, their sisters, anyone familiar. But the protocols were iron. Only the approved attendants, only the sanctified space, only the ancient ways that had killed queens for centuries but might protect this one. The tradition was stronger than compassion, the ritual more important than the woman at its center. On the final day before confinement, the queen was allowed one last glimpse of the outside world, a formal farewell to the court. She processed through the great hall in her finest gown, knowing it would be weeks or months before she wore anything but birthing shifts again. The courtiers bowed and curtsied. Some faces showed genuine concern. Others barely concealed their calculation. Who would rise if she fell? Who would benefit if she produced only a daughter, who already had their eye on the king's attention? The walk back to her chambers was the longest of her life. Each step carried her further from the world and deeper into the ritual that would consume her. The doors closed behind her one by one. First, the great hall, then the public corridors, then the private passages. Finally, the door to the confinement chamber itself. It shut with the solid thud of finality. The locks turned. The keys were given to the head attendant. The queen stood in her transformed chambers, surrounded by holy relics and stern-faced women. and understood the truth that every queen before her had discovered. She had entered these rooms as a person. She would only leave them if she could prove herself a successful vessel. The hammer strikes that had sealed her windows weeks ago still echoed in her ears. But now she heard them differently. Not construction, destruction, the systematic demolition of everything she was beyond her ability to produce an heir. And somewhere in the darkness beyond those sealed windows, in rooms she could no longer reach, courtiers were already whispering about what would happen if she failed. The transformation was complete. The queen existed now only in the space between those tapestried walls, between the blessed bed and the watching women, between life and death. The confinement had begun, and with it, the countdown to a labor that would either free her or destroy her. But she had no idea that some queens never emerged from these rooms. That the very protections surrounding her had become the perfect trap, that the holy relics and careful preparations had created not a sanctuary but a tomb waiting for an occupant. The door locked, the keys turned, and in the sudden silence, every woman in that chamber could hear the truth that tradition tried to muffle. This wasn't about protecting royal births. This had never been about safety or sanctity. This was about control, complete, total, terrifying control. And she was about to discover just how far that control extended, when even her screams would be muffled by tapestries meant to keep the outside world from hearing what really happened in these sacred chambers. The council chamber door slammed shut with deliberate force. The sound echoed through stone corridors like a declaration. Eleanor of Austria, 6 months into her pregnancy, pressed her ear against the oak panels. She could hear them clearly. Her husband's advisers discussing tax reforms, military movements, diplomatic marriages, all the business of running a kingdom that she'd once been part of. The words grew muffled as they moved away from the door, taking the power with them. She'd attended those meetings just 4 months ago. Her voice had carried weight when she spoke of her homeland's interests. The councillors had nodded respectfully at her suggestions about trade routes she knew better than any of them. She'd read the diplomatic correspondence in 3 languages, adding her seal beside the king's on the important documents. The smooth wax had been warm beneath her signet ring. Now that same seal gathered dust in a drawer she wasn't supposed to open. The transformation happened gradually, then suddenly. First, they suggested she might be more comfortable in a chair further from the drafty windows during council sessions. For the baby's health, of course. Then they wondered if the late meetings might tire her unnecessarily. Within weeks, her chair was removed entirely. No formal declaration, no direct dismissal. Just an empty space where her authority used to sit. The scratch of quills on parchment continued without her. Decisions about her own dowry lands, made in rooms she could no longer enter. Catherine of Aragon discovered this isolation during her 4th pregnancy. She'd ruled England as regent while Henry campaigned in France. She'd raised armies, signed treaties, sent the bloodied coat of the Scottish king to her husband as proof of her victory. The council had bowed to her then. They'd called her Your Majesty with genuine reverence. But the moment her belly began to swell, those same men found reasons to conduct business elsewhere. Urgent matters that couldn't wait for her slower pace. Documents that needed signing while she rested. The rustling of papers in distant rooms became the sound of her relevance disappearing. The ladies-in-waiting became her only source of intelligence. They carried whispers like currency, trading overheard conversations for favour. Lord Chancellor met with Venetian ambassadors without your presence, Majesty. The Duke discussed your dowry allocation in private session. Each report another cut. The Queen learned to read political shifts in the nervous glances of her women, in the way certain ladies suddenly found excuses to attend other duties. Rats fleeing a ship that hadn't quite started sinking. Yet, power in medieval courts was proximity, being in the room, catching the king's eye during crucial moments, whispering the right word at the right time. Pregnancy severed those connections with surgical precision. The king visited her chambers, yes, but these were conjugal visits, not political ones. He spoke of the child's health, never state business. He brought gifts of jewels and silks, not documents requiring her seal. The conversation stayed carefully superficial, while kingdoms shifted in rooms she couldn't reach. Some queens fought this exile with correspondence. Isabella of Portugal maintained a network of letters that crisscrossed Europe like spider silk. Her scribes worked in shifts, taking her dictation between bouts of morning sickness. The sealing wax dripped red as blood onto parchment that carried her will to distant courts. But letters moved slowly. By the time her responses arrived, the moment had passed. Decisions had been made. Her carefully crafted arguments reached councillors who'd already moved 3 moves ahead on the political chessboard. The rival factions smelled weakness like wolves scent injury. Courtiers who'd waited years for an opening found it in her swelling belly. They scheduled crucial meetings during her rest periods. They whispered concerns about her health to the king. Such a delicate condition. Perhaps the stress of governance might harm the precious air. Their footsteps quickened with purpose in corridors where hers had slowed. Each passing week of pregnancy was another week of unchallenged influence building. Margaret of Anjou documented the systematic campaign against her. The Duke of York's supporters grew bolder with each month of her pregnancy. They questioned old decisions she'd championed. They reopened, settled matters. They suggested new advisors for positions that had been firmly hers to fill. All while she sat trapped in chambers that grew smaller as her body grew larger. She could hear their voices rising in confidence through the walls, could feel the tectonic plates of power shifting beneath her swollen feet. The physical separation reinforced the political one. Queens were moved to chambers farther from the centers of power as their pregnancies progressed. For safety, they claimed, for quiet and rest. But those distant rooms meant longer walks to anywhere important. More stairs to climb, more reasons to simply stay put while the business of ruling happened elsewhere, the scrape of her chair being pushed back from yet another table she'd never return to. The soft thud of doors closing on conversations she'd never rejoin. The king's mistresses often gained most during these intervals. With the queen indisposed, they filled the empty spaces, not just in the royal bed, but in the royal ear. They attended the entertainments where politics happened under cover of dancing. They caught the casual comments that shaped policy. They wore the jewels that should have adorned the queen at state occasions. Their laughter echoed in halls where the queen's footsteps no longer fell. Some mistresses gained titles, lands, and influence that outlasted the pregnancies that enabled them. Financial control slipped away finger by finger. Queens who'd managed their own estates found stewards making decisions without consultation. Emergency measures, they explained, while Her Majesty was indisposed. Temporary arrangements that somehow became permanent. The clink of coins in treasuries she could no longer access. The rustle of account books being rewritten by new hands. Property deeds transferred, incomes redirected, all perfectly legal, all perfectly timed for when she couldn't fight back. The foreign ambassadors were the cruelest. They'd once waited hours for audiences with her. They'd brought gifts from their sovereigns specifically for her approval. They'd recognized her as a power worth courting. Now they barely nodded when passing her chambers. Their reports home mentioned her only in context of the pregnancy. Will she survive? Will it be male? Their real business was with whoever held power now. The clip of diplomatic heels walking past her door without stopping. The murmur of negotiations in languages she spoke fluently but could no longer use. Some queens discovered the plots against them only after emerging from confinement. If they emerged, Eleanor of Provence returned from her lying-in to find her entire household reorganized. New ladies who owed her no loyalty. New clerks who reported to the king's men. New protocols that required the king's permission for decisions she'd once made alone. The birth had been successful. The child was healthy, but the woman who'd entered that chamber with authority exited it with only the title. The rest had been carved away while she labored in darkness. The pregnancy correspondence reveals their growing panic. Letters home became increasingly desperate. Send trusted servants, they begged. Send gold I can hide. Send anything that might help me maintain some thread of independence. But even these letters were often intercepted, read by eyes they weren't meant for, used as evidence of their scheming. Their isolation wasn't accidental. It was architected. Every tradition that separated them from power had been designed for exactly this purpose. The children themselves became weapons in this war. A successful birth of a male heir might restore some influence, but daughters were disasters. Multiple daughters catastrophic. Each female child was proof of the queen's failure, evidence that perhaps a new wife might produce the necessary sons. The whispers started even before the birthing blood was cleaned away. The queen, weakened from labor, would hear them through the walls, discussing her replacement while she still bled from delivering their disappointment. Mary of Modena experienced this horror firsthand. Her first surviving child was a daughter. Within days, pamphlets appeared suggesting the king seek an annulment. Catholic plots, they whispered. Cursed bloodlines. The baby's cries were drowned out by the louder noise of political machinery grinding into motion. She clutched her infant daughter, while councillors who'd once bowed to her now openly discussed whether she should be set aside. Their voices carried clearly. They wanted her to hear. Wanted her to know how precarious her position had become. The smart queens learned to play the game differently. They cultivated allies among the church hierarchy who couldn't be so easily dismissed. They maintained correspondence with powerful relatives who might intervene. They hid resources against future need. But all of this had to be done from the prison of their condition. Every move made while heavy with child, every counterplot hatched between waves of morning sickness, fighting for political survival while their bodies betrayed them to biology's demands. Recovery offered no respite. The churching ceremony that marked a queen's return to public life was weeks away. More weeks of isolation while rivals consolidated gains. Some queens emerged to find the entire court transformed. New alliances, new power structures, new realities that hadn't existed when they'd entered confinement. They'd given the kingdom its heir but lost their kingdom in the process. The bells that rang for the successful birth also tolled for their political death. The most terrifying sound was silence. When the whispers stopped suddenly, when the footsteps paused outside their door, then hurried away. When the king's visits grew shorter and more formal. These silences spoke louder than any direct threat. They meant decisions were being made in rooms so secret even the gossips couldn't access them. They meant the queen's fate was being sealed in documents she'd never see. They meant that pregnancy had succeeded in its hidden purpose, not just to produce an heir, but to produce an opportunity, a chance to reshape power while its wielder lay trapped in ceremonial darkness. Anne of Austria understood this too late. 8 months pregnant, she discovered her husband's chief minister had used her absence to completely restructure the government. New departments she had no influence over, new positions filled with his creatures, new protocols that would persist long after her child was born. She raged in her chambers, but the tapestries muffled her fury. She demanded audiences, but her condition made travel impossible. She wrote letter after letter, but they disappeared into the vast machinery of a bureaucracy that no longer recognized her authority. The scratch of her desperate quill was the only sound in chambers that had become a political tomb. This isolation wasn't medieval cruelty, it was medieval genius, a system designed to neutralize queens at their most vulnerable moment, to transform pregnancy from a source of power into a season of powerlessness. Every tradition that seemed to protect actually imprisoned, every ceremony that honored actually diminished. The queens who survived learned to expect this exile, to plan for it, to hide what resources they could before the doors closed. But most discovered too late that pregnancy was when their enemies made their moves, when rivals struck, when the architecture of their influence was quietly dismantled, piece by piece. The baby would come, or it wouldn't. The queen would survive, or she wouldn't. But the woman who emerged from that chamber would find herself in a different world than the one she'd left, a world where her political existence had been erased as thoroughly as her windows had been covered, where her voice had been silenced as completely as those tapestries muffled sound, where she'd been transformed from player to piece in a game that continued without her participation, the greatest triumph of her life becoming the instrument of her political death. While she lay trapped in darkness, her enemies at court were already planning for a future without her. The Queen's plea came out in a torrent of Portuguese, a desperate whisper for water, for her mother, for God. The two midwives exchanged a look over her sweat-soaked sheets. One of them, a woman with a face like a dried apple, patted the Queen's hand and muttered something in coarse, northern English. The words were meant to be soothing. They sounded like stones rattling in a cup. The Queen shook her head, tears streaking the grime on her face, and tried again. This time, her voice cracked into a sob. The midwife just smiled, a tight, thin-lipped expression, and offered her a damp cloth to bite on. This was a new kind of hell. The physical agony was one thing. She had expected that. But the silence inside the noise was another. She was surrounded by women. Their skirts rustled. Their shoes shuffled on the stone floor. Their voices were a constant, low drone of prayers and instructions and gossip, but not one of them spoke a language she could understand. Not one of them could decipher her cries beyond the raw animal sound of pain. Her own ladies, the ones who'd come with her from her sunny homeland, had been dismissed weeks ago. Too foreign, the King's Council had decided. This birth must be a purely English affair. The customs were as alien as the language. Back home, women laboured in chairs, aided by gravity. Here, they insisted she lie flat, pulling on ropes attached to the bedposts until her arms burned. They burned herbs that smelled of rot and decay, filling the air with an acrid smoke that made her gag. The sound of the herbs hissing in the brazier was like a serpent's warning. She tried to gesture for them to stop, waving a weak hand toward the brazier. The younger midwife simply thought she was cold and piled another heavy fur on top of her. The weight pressed down, stealing the breath she so desperately needed. One of them produced a small, carved wooden figure. A local saint, perhaps. Its face was a crude mask of painted terror. They pressed it into her hand, closing her fingers around it. She recoiled, the foreign wood feeling slick and wrong against her skin. She followed the saints of her homeland. This grim idol meant nothing to her. She let it drop to the floor, where it landed with a soft clatter. The women gasped. A collective intake of breath that sucked the warmth from the room. They looked at each other with wide, fearful eyes. One crossed herself 3 times. Now they believed she was not just foreign, but cursed. She remembered dictating a letter to her sister just before the confinement began. Her one remaining Portuguese lady-in-waiting had held the quill, her own hand trembling in sympathy. The scratch of the nib on the parchment had been the only familiar sound in weeks. "My dearest, the air here is as heavy as wet wool, and the people are stones. They watch me as if I am a broodmare they have paid too much for. I hear them whispering about my accent, my skin, my prayers. Now they have taken my windows and my language. I fear that if I scream, no one will truly hear me." The plop of melted wax sealing the letter had sounded so final. A tiny, desperate message sent out from a fortress she could not escape. A sudden clap of thunder outside the sealed chamber made the midwives shriek. The storm had been raging for 2 days, its muffled drumming a constant backdrop to her suffering. But this was different. This was close. One of the women ran to the door, pressing her ear against it. The other began a frantic, whining chant, scattering something from a pouch onto the floorboards. The Queen could smell salt and something else, something sharp and bitter. The sounds of their panic were far more terrifying than the storm. They were not afraid for her. They were afraid times of times her. Afraid of the foreign queen whose bad luck had brought the devil's weather down upon the castle. Her pain shifted. A new, grinding pressure that made her arch her back. She tried to explain. She used the few English words she knew. Baby, down, wrong. She pointed, her finger jabbing at the base of her spine. The older midwife simply nodded again, that same infuriating, empty smile on her face. She patted the Queen's belly and said a single, cheerful word. Soon. The word was a lie. The Queen knew it. This was not the pain that meant soon. This was the pain that meant something was breaking. She grabbed the woman's wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. She looked the midwife in the eye, pouring all her terror, all her certainty, into that one look. The midwife pulled her hand away gently. She murmured to her companion. The Queen heard the English word for hysterical. They thought she was losing her mind. They began to sing a lullaby. a droning, tuneless thing meant to calm a fussy child. The sound was maddening. It papered over her terror, dismissed her knowledge of her own body. They were treating her like a farm animal, incapable of understanding her own condition. She could feel the baby turning, twisting into a position that felt like it would tear her in two. But her words were useless sounds in a room full of people who had already decided what she was feeling. She tried gestures, pantomiming the sensation, trying to show them where the agony was centered. The younger midwife watched her with pity, then dipped a cloth in cool water and placed it on her forehead. The gesture of kindness was the cruelest cut of all. It was so completely, utterly wrong. She didn't need cooling. She needed them to listen. She needed them to understand the specific, technical thing her body was screaming at her. The sounds of their incomprehensible comfort became a form of torture. The rustle of their clothes as they moved around her, doing nothing helpful, was the sound of her own doom approaching. She could write her name in 4 languages. She could debate theology with bishops. She could read maps and command a household of hundreds. But in this room, she was less than a child. She was a mute, a creature of pure biology, whose attempts to communicate were just noise. Her frantic Portuguese words faded into gasps. Her carefully learned English phrases deserted her. All that was left was the universal language of pain, and it was not specific enough to save her. The isolation was complete. She was an island, drowning in a sea of well-meaning, ignorant faces. Her knowledge, her status, her very identity had been stripped away, leaving only a body they did not understand, laboring according to rules they could not read. She looked at the strange wooden saint on the floor. She looked at the midwives chanting their foreign prayers. She listened to the storm raging in a world she could no longer see. The terror of her loneliness was a pain sharper than any contraction. But language barriers were nothing compared to what happened when the labor pains began in earnest. The first scream lasted 3 hours. Not continuously, that would have killed her, but in waves that built and crashed and built again, each one dragging her further from shore. The midwives counted them like tides, marking tallies on a slate that scraped with each new line. 20 contractions in the first hour, 40 in the second. By the third hour, they stopped counting. The chalk dropped to the floor with a tiny clatter that somehow sounded louder than the Queen's agony. The physicians waited outside the door. Their boots shifted on stone, creating a rhythm of impatience. They weren't allowed in yet, not until the midwives admitted failure. The sound of their pacing filtered through the oak like a countdown. Inside, the Queen's world had shrunk to the space between contractions, those blessed moments when her body unclenched, and she could gulp air that tasted of herbs and fear. The senior midwife's hands moved constantly, checking, adjusting, her movements accompanied by the wet sounds of examination that made the younger attendants look away. Blood appeared first as spots on the linen, dark roses blooming across white fabric. The women changed the sheets without speaking, their efficiency practiced from other births, other blood. The soiled linens piled in a corner, each edition marking time in crimson. Outside, thunder rolled across the December sky. Inside, the Queen's pulse thundered louder. The midwife pressed her ear to the swollen belly, listening for sounds only she could interpret. Her face remained carefully neutral, but her assistant saw the way her jaw tightened. Prayer books appeared when the bleeding increased. The women formed a circle around the bed, their voices rising in Latin unison. Ave Maria, gratia plena. The words bounced off tapestried walls while the Queen writhed between them. Someone lit more candles. The smell of tallow mixed with iron and sweat. Shadows danced on the walls like witnesses to ancient rites. The prayers grew louder as the Queen grew quieter. Not from improvement, from exhaustion. Her voice had torn itself raw on screams that brought no relief. The relics came out of their cases next. Finger bones of saints pressed to her belly, splinters of holy wood placed beneath her tongue. The Queen gagged on the taste of centuries-old faith, while her body tore itself apart from within. Each new relic brought its own ritual, its own desperate hope. The women handling them moved with increasing urgency. Their whispered consultations grew sharp with fear. Something was wrong. Something beyond the usual horrors of birth. The baby hadn't moved in an hour. Water. Endless basins of water carried in by servants who weren't allowed to look at the Queen. The splash of it being poured, the slosh as bloodied cloths were wrung out. The drip, drip, drip of perspiration from the midwife's face as she worked. Everything was wet. The sheets, the floor, the very air seemed saturated with the effort of bringing life into the world, or preventing death from taking it. The distinction blurred as hours became days. Time measured not in bells but in the space between breaths, between heartbeats, between hope and despair. The king's physician finally entered on the second day. His medical bag clinked with instruments that caught the candlelight, metal things, sharp things, things that promised to solve problems by creating new ones. He examined the Queen with hands that had dissected corpses, clinical, detached, speaking in Latin to the midwives who nodded and backed away. The Queen understood enough to know they were discussing her like a problem to be solved, not a person to be saved. The physician produced a vial of liquid that bubbled strangely. "Poppy," he said, "for the pain." She drank because refusing took energy she didn't have. The bitter taste coated her throat. Within minutes, the world began to slide sideways. Colors leaked from the tapestries. Sounds stretched like taffy. The pain didn't leave but moved somewhere adjacent to her body. She could observe it without owning it. Through this strange new distance, she heard them discussing options. The child was turned wrong, sideways, stuck. The physician's hands moved as he explained procedures with names that sounded like torture devices, procedures that saved babies by destroying mothers. More physicians arrived as the second day bled into the third. They crowded the chamber, their black robes making them look like carrion birds. Each had opinions, each had instruments. They argued in Latin while the Queen floated in her poppy haze. One wanted to cut, another wanted to pull. A third insisted on waiting for nature. Their voices rose and fell like a tide of academic discourse, while she drowned in the reality of their theories. Finally, they agreed on action. The instruments came out. The midwives were pushed aside. Now it was men's work, men's hands, men's decisions about her body. The hooks came first. Curved metal designed to find purchase on small limbs, to guide what wouldn't come naturally. The Queen felt the cold intrusion even through the drugs, felt the scraping search for something to grasp. The physician muttered prayers or curses, hard to tell which. His assistant held her legs while he worked. The sound of metal against flesh, against bone. The wet resistance of a body refusing to yield its burden. Minutes stretched into hours. The hooks found nothing useful, only pain pathways previously undiscovered. Forceps next. Larger, more brutal in their simplicity. Giant metal salad tongs designed to grasp an entire head. If they could find it, if they could reach it, if the passage was wide enough. The physician's breathing grew labored with effort. Sweat dripped from his nose onto her exposed flesh. She could hear the forceps clicking open and closed, testing their grip on air before attempting flesh. The first insertion made her scream despite the poppy, despite exhaustion, despite everything. Some agonies transcended all attempts at numbing. The arguing resumed when the forceps failed. Younger physicians wanted to attempt a technique learned from Arab texts. Older ones insisted on traditional methods. Methods that had killed queens for centuries but at least had precedent. The Queen listened to them debate her fate in a language she barely understood, heard terms that meant cutting. That meant choosing between mother and child. That meant accepting losses. The metal instruments clinked against each other as they gestured. Each clink another option, another horror. Another path to an ending nobody wanted to name. Blood loss became the pressing issue. Too much, too fast. The Queen's lips had gone white. Her pulse fluttered like a trapped bird. The physicians sent for more supplies, more instruments, more prayers. The servants who answered their calls moved with the hushed urgency of those who smell death approaching. Fresh linens arrived, fresh water, fresh candles to replace those burned down to nubs. Everything fresh except hope. That had gone stale somewhere in the second day. Now they were just managing decline. controlling the speed of catastrophe. The Queen's consciousness flickered like the candles. In, out, present, gone. In her lucid moments, she heard them discussing her replacement, not cruelly, practically. If she died, the baby might still be saved. If the baby died, she might survive to try again. If both died, the king would need a new wife quickly. The succession required it. The kingdom demanded it. Her death was already being absorbed into the greater machinery of state. Her struggle reduced to a political problem requiring a political solution. She wanted to rage at the unfairness. She managed only a whimper. Religious fervor reached new heights as the situation deteriorated. Priests were summoned. Last rites prepared, just in case. The Latin prayers took on a different quality, less hopeful, more final. The Queen recognized the cadences from other deathbeds, other endings. The oil they traced on her forehead felt like surrender, like marking her for collection. She tried to protest, to insist she wasn't finished. But the words came out as mere breath, less than whispers. The priests continued their work, experienced in ignoring the protests of the dying. The decision came in the last hours of the third day. They would cut, not to save her. That hope had passed, but to perhaps save the child. The physician explained this to the midwives, who wept openly now. No more professional composure. They knew what this meant, had seen it before. The instruments for the procedure were specially made, kept sharp, kept ready. The physician tested the blade against his thumb. A bead of blood welled up, proof of readiness. He approached the bed with the solemnity of an executioner, which, in a way, he was. The Queen understood despite the drugs, despite the pain, despite everything. This was how it would end. In this dark room, surrounded by strangers, her body opened not in birth but in sacrifice. She tried to pray, but couldn't remember the words in any language, tried to picture home but saw only tapestries, tried to feel anger but found only exhaustion. The blade moved closer. The physicians steadied their hands. The midwives turned away. And somewhere beyond the sealed windows, in a world she'd never see again, courtiers were already discussing her replacement. As the third day of labor began, everyone in the palace knew this confinement might become permanent. The king's footsteps echoed through the corridor with measured precision. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then silence. Henry VIII stood outside his queen's birthing chamber, counting the hours since Jane Seymour's screams had stopped. The sudden quiet pressed against his ears like water. Behind that heavy door, physicians worked in hushed urgency, while his third wife lay somewhere between this world and the next. The fever had started 12 hours after Prince Edward's birth. First, a slight warmth the midwives dismissed as normal. Then the shaking began. Jane's teeth chattered so hard they could hear it through the oak door. The physicians bled her. They purged her. They packed her with herbs that filled the air with the smell of decay. Nothing helped. The Queen, who'd given England its prince, was slipping away while her baby son wailed in distant nurseries. Word travelled fast through Westminster's stone halls. Courtiers who'd celebrated the prince's birth 3 days earlier now spoke in funeral whispers. The Spanish ambassador drafted letters to Emperor Charles, describing symptoms in clinical detail. The French envoy noted the king's pale face, his reluctance to enter the chamber where death waited. Everyone understood the mathematics. A male heir gained, a queen lost. The scales of succession balanced in blood. Jane wasn't the first to pay this price. The rolls of history were littered with queens who'd survived the birth only to die days later. Childbed fever, they called it. As if naming it made it less terrible. The infection crept through exhausted bodies, turning triumph into tragedy. The same chambers that had echoed with newborn cries became death rooms. The same attendants who'd celebrated successful deliveries found themselves preparing bodies for burial. The symptoms followed a predictable pattern. First, the fever, then the chills. The belly swelled again, this time with poison instead of life. The bleeding that should have stopped continued, dark and wrong-smelling. Some queens lasted days, others only hours. But once the fever took hold, the outcome rarely changed. The physicians might argue over treatments, the priests might pray for miracles, the end remained the same. Elizabeth Woodville had watched two queens die this way before her own turn came. She knew the signs, recognized the particular flush that meant fever, not exertion. When her own time came, she made her ladies promise to care for her children, not save her. She understood the bargain. Every queen did. Your life for an heir, your future for the dynasties. The contracts they'd signed as young brides had always included this possibility, written in invisible ink between the lines about dowries and alliances. The speed of replacement shocked even hardened courtiers. Jane Seymour died on October 24th. By November, Henry's ambassadors were already in Europe, carrying portraits of eligible princesses. The funeral meets barely cold before the marriage negotiations began. Hans Holbein painted potential brides, while Jane's son learned to breathe without his mother. The court wore mourning black, while secretly calculating which foreign alliance would benefit England most. Anne of Cleves arrived to find Jane's possessions still in the royal chambers. Her predecessor's perfume lingered in wardrobes hastily emptied. Her monogram remained carved into furniture, quickly repainted. Servants occasionally called her by the dead queen's name. The ghost of Jane Seymour haunted every corner, a reminder of what happened to queens who succeeded in their primary duty. Anne learned to live with that ghost, to see her own potential fate in every mirror. The children left motherless created their own kind of tragedy. Edward VI grew up hearing stories of the mother who died giving him life. Portraits of Jane Seymour hung in his chambers, her painted eyes watching a son she'd held for less than 2 weeks. He learned Latin and Greek and the art of kingship, but no one could teach him what his mother's voice sounded like, what songs she might have sung, what stories she might have told. The price of his existence was her absence. Royal nurseries filled with these half-orphans, princes and princesses raised by